Paul's defense. Paul is the first couple of things that went on in Paul's life were these rhetorics, these speeches, these diatribes where he's trying to get people saved. That's what he's trying to do. From chapter 21, 22 to the end, he shifts gears. He has some evangelism in here, but it is more what we call forensic dialogue, forensic rhetoric. He's just defending himself. They're trying to kill him. The Jews do not like him. And he's moving his way up the chain of Rome. God spoke to Paul and assured him that he was going to go to Rome, that nothing was going to kill him before then. And so, although he's nervous and he gets in some precarious situations, he trusts God and he knows that he eventually has to go to Rome. And so, every time he gets arrested, every time he gets involved with an official, he just goes further and further up the chain of command. This is the fifth time he's had to defend himself in Acts chapter 25. The first is in Acts chapter 22. If you remember, there's a Jewish mob at the Antonia fortress in Israel, and they're coming at him. And they want to kill him, and this is the first time he has to defend himself. The second time is in Acts chapter 23, and it's the Sanhedrin. So this mob of Jews, and then he goes before the Sanhedrin, and Claudius is involved, the commander of all the troops in Jerusalem. And Claudius says, listen, I really don't know what's going on, and so if you guys, the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of Israel, the religious Supreme Court, if you guys will come and figure this out, it'll be great. But they can't figure it out. And so there's a plot to kill Paul. They're going to try to ambush him in the middle of the night, and all these things are going on. So if you remember, Claudius said, I'm going to move you up to Caesarea. I'm going to move you from Jerusalem, which is in the center of Israel, up to the coast at Caesarea. And when he gets up to Caesarea, he meets the governor of Judea, whose name is Felix. Felix is the one married to Drusilla. Drusilla is the one that died in the Vesuvian eruption in Pompeii about 40 years after this event. And Felix does the same thing. Felix says, I really don't know what he's done. And the Jews hire a lawyer, it's a guy named Tertullus, and Tertullus comes and he's loaded for bear. He's got all this stuff about Paul, that you blasphemed the temple, you violated Jewish ritual, you were a leader of a sect, a religious sect, and all these stuff. And Paul systematically defended himself. So much so that Felix said, I can't do anything with him, I don't see any guilt. But Felix appeased the Jewish folks, and he said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to turn you over to be killed. I'm not going to send you back to Jerusalem, nor am I going to let you out. So you're going to stay in prison for a while. It ends up being 2 years. And so Paul, between chapter 24 and 25, Paul's been in prison for 2 years. It's not a labor-intensive prison. It's a relatively calm prison. Because he's a Roman citizen. So he gets visitors, his people, Timothy, and those folks can come and see him. He can write letters. He has a little bit of freedom. But he's locked up for 2 years. At the end of 2 years, Felix is no good. The main job of the governor of Judea is to keep peace in Jerusalem. That's the main thing, because the Jews were, especially at feasts, they get a little rowdy. And they didn't like the Romans there. And so the governor was appointed. Pilate had that role with Jesus in Jesus' time. So the governor of Judea, his role is keep peace. No matter what you do, keep peace. Don't let the Jews get out of hand. Well, Felix didn't. They had a revolt. A lot of people died. And so Felix gets removed at the end of chapter 24. At the beginning of chapter 25, there's a new governor in town. His name is Pontius Festus. And Festus is going to take over. And when we start chapter 25, you're going to see one of the first things that happen when Festus comes in and takes over is they say to Festus, you got this guy that's been in prison for 2 years, you probably need to do something about it. It needs to be adjudicated or something. And so that's where chapter 25 picks up. It's 2 years after the fact. Felix has been fired. Festus has been hired. Festus is now on the scene. And this is going to be the fourth defense that Paul makes. The first is to the Jews. The second is to the Sanhedrin. The third is to Felix. The fourth is to Festus. The fifth is going to be to Herod Agrippa the first. So he's just moving up the chain. And so Luke's purpose here is to show us really what's happening inside the Roman administration, what's happening with Paul, and how God is preserving the gospel, how God is preserving this thing for Paul to minister to as many folks as possible. So if you look at chapter 25, verse 1, here's the way this thing starts. Festus then, having arrived in the province 3 days later, went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. So his name is Porcius Festus. He is more moderate and wiser than Felix. He's just better. And his decision, and you can see the wisdom in the decision, because as soon as he gets there, he agrees to meet with the Jews in Jerusalem. That's the first thing he does. He wants to see what's going on. That's a pretty wise thing. You know, you as the leader now actually go put your finger on the pulse of the people, find out what's happening, and try to get a gauge for what's going on. So that's how this is setting up. Festus is on the scene, and he says, "Let me talk to these Jews because they're upset about something, you know, and I got to figure it out." So look at verses 2 and 3. And the chief priests and the leading men of the Jews brought charges against Paul, and they were urging him, requesting a concession against Paul that he might have him brought to Jerusalem. And then when you see parentheses, that's in the original, but it's what we call an editorial comment. It's not part of the narrative. It's just something that Luke wants us to know. And so read it like this. They go to Festus, all the Jews, and they bring those same charges, probably the same charges that Tertullus brought in chapter 24. They bring them up again to the new governor. And then look at verse 3. They request a concession against Paul that he might have him brought to Jerusalem. So that's the story. Luke is saying all these Jews meet with Festus. Festus agrees to meet with them. And they request that Paul be sent back to Jerusalem. And then Luke says, oh, by the way, you should know this. They plan to kill him on the way there. It's not really part of the story, but it's an editorial comment. It's something that Luke wants us to know that, hey, by the way, if you're reading this story and you see that they want him sent back to Jerusalem, here's why they wanted that to happen. You know, they're going to kill him on the way there. So the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem realize that they don't have a lot of hope getting rid of Paul through Rome. The courts are not helping them. The Sanhedrin didn't help them. That's their own court. It didn't help them. And then when he went to Felix, Felix didn't help. And so they all got together and they said, Rome's not helping us in this matter. So we have to come up with our own plan. And so they said, here's the plan. We'll go to Festus. He's a new guy. He don't know anything that's going on. He's brand new here. And so we'll tell Festus, hey, we'll take this guy off your hands. You know, it's moving back to Jerusalem. We'll try him back in Jerusalem. And Luke said the reason they want to do that is because on the way back, they're just going to ambush him and kill him. All right, so that's how this thing is setting up. Now, that there is a change in leadership with the Jews. And it's going to sound funny when I say this, but Ananias is out as the chief priest, and Ishmael is the new high priest. And I know it's a weird name to have as the chief priest of Israel, of the Jews, but that's his name, Ishmael. At the end of Felix's term, Ishmael comes to power, and so the Jews are hoping maybe he has more backbone. Maybe he's more violent. Maybe he'll really take Paul out, as it were. And so that's the plan. You know, Rome's too weak. We have to do it ourselves. Let's get him shipped back, and somewhere during the night on the way back, we'll ambush him and we'll take him out. So verse 4 and 5. Festus then answered that Paul was being kept in custody at Caesarea, and that he himself was about to leave shortly. Therefore he said, let the influential men among you go there with me, and if there's anything wrong about the man, let them prosecute him. So here's Festus's wisdom again. Festus said, I'm not agreeing to do what y'all. And there's no indication here. Luke doesn't tell us that Festus figured out their plan, that he knew they were going to kill him. There's nothing there that indicates that. Festus just said, "No, I need to see for myself." So they're in Jerusalem. They got to go up north to Caesarea. That's where Paul is. Festus says, "Here's what we're going to do. You guys, if you think you have a case, you go with me. I'm going to go back and talk to this guy because I got to find out what's happening here because my job is to keep peace. I can't let y'all just murder somebody. I have to keep peace. And so I'm going to go up. My advice is send your leading guys, most influential Jews that you have. You guys go up to Caesarea with me, investigate it, and if we all come to a consensus that this guy's guilty of something, then you can prosecute him, and then we'll let the courts dictate." So that's where we're at now in this story. Now look at verses 6 through 12 is what we call a pericope. It's a group of scripture that tell a story. And so this is the next grouping. And you'll see because there's some words in here. Verse 6. After he had spent not more than 8 or 10 days among them, he went down to Caesarea. Notice the wording again. He went down to Caesarea. Caesarea is north. But anytime you're in Jerusalem, everything's down from Jerusalem. And if you're outside of Jerusalem, everything's up to Jerusalem. That's why you can't, people that are like flat earthers, that say the Bible teaches these flat earth theories, it doesn't, because when the Bible talks about like east, west, north, south, the angels on the four corners, and flat earth people say, "Oh, see, it's four corners." But that's not the way they use it. The way they use directions like that are not the way we use them. And so, so they're going after he only been there 8 or 10 days, and so now he's going to go to Caesarea. And so the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. So they go up to Caesarea, and the word for tribunal in Greek, you're going to know this, is bema. That's the word. It's a judgment seat. So Festus goes up and takes his place on the judgment seat, on the bema, which is exactly what you and I will be before Jesus when he's at the bema seat and we're standing before judgment with him. This is a public place. It's going to be where, they have any entertainment, all they had to do is go out to public trials and stuff. So this is a public thing. He's got this semi-throne erected out in the public square, and they get Paul out of prison. They bring him out, and they're gonna have a trial. Basically, they're gonna quiz Paul, and so Paul is going to give a defense. Now look how this escalates. Verse 7, after Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges. So after 8 days, 10 days, Festus goes up to Caesarea, or down to Caesarea, depending on if you want to use biblical language or not. And they bring Paul out, and all these Jews that go with him get around Paul, and they make a lot of charges. If you want to know what the charges are, go back and read chapter 24, verses 5 through 6. It's the exact same charges that Tertullus brought. That he was a blasphemer, he was a heretic, he defamed the temple, all these things that Paul did. And so now they're making the same stuff all over again. So Paul's going to do the same thing that he did before Felix. He just denies them. Just categorically denies them. Just didn't happen. Look at verse 8. They bring all these charges, and then look what Luke says in verse 7, which they could not prove. There's no proof, there's no witnesses, and so all the Jews come out and gather around Festus and the tribunal, and it's, he did this, and so, but Luke doesn't tell us this, but here's how it probably played out. Festus probably said, well, show me the evidence, bring your first witness. Well, we don't have a witness, just take our word for it, well, I can't take your word for it, show me something, show me something in writing, give me a verbal witness, give me somebody, and they can't. There's no witness, because there's no crime. So look at verse 8. And so Paul said in his own defense, I have committed no offense either against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. That's it. Out of 5 defenses, this is the shortest. Because they don't have any proof. They don't have a witness. And so they say, hey, we got all this stuff. He's like, show me the proof. Well, we won't have any. Okay, Paul, what's yours? Well, I didn't do it. That's how this one went down. It's real short, it's real simple, real sweet, real concise, right to the point. Here's what he did. I didn't do it. That's the trial. That's the extent of it. So all Paul had to do is deny it. I mean, categorically, I did not do these things. And so because they have no proof, this trial proceeded just like the one with Felix. And so Luke here just kind of summarized it. But it went down just like the one in chapter 24. Nobody can prove anything because he didn't do it. There's no crime. Verse 9. But Festus, here's where the Romans kind of irritate me. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor. So this new governor, he's brand new. What's the majority of the population of Judea? Jews. And so this brand new governor has only been there like 8 or 10 days. He don't want to do anything to turn the Jews against him because he don't want to end up like Felix. He don't want a revolt or a rebellion and get fired or worse. And so he wants to do them a favor. And so here's really what this says or what this means. In verse 9, Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? In other words, let me kind of paraphrase Festus. Hey, Paul, I don't know what to do, man. I don't know what to do. I don't see any evidence. I don't have a witness. They're not proving their case. So I don't know. But there's a lot of them. And because there's a lot of them, the last thing I can do is have a revolt in Jerusalem. And so he turns to Paul and he says, okay, hey, will you do me a solid here? Will you agree to go back to Jerusalem? I'll go with you, and we'll have another trial in Jerusalem, and they can bring these charges up again. All right, that's the plan. So what are they going to do to him on the way to Jerusalem? They're going to kill him. Festus doesn't know that, but that's the plan. And if Paul would have agreed to it, that's exactly what probably would have transpired, or God would have had to do some miraculous deliverance of Paul. And so Festus said, hey, I really don't know how to proceed here, because I don't want them mad, and I don't really see a resolution of this unless you agree to go back, because I want to stay in their good graces. So are you willing to move this trial back down to Jerusalem? Now, unless you're a murderer or a thief that gets caught in the act of stealing, you can request to move up the chain if you're a Roman citizen, which Paul is, and he's not being accused of murder or any of this kind of stuff. And so notice what this is saying without saying it. Festus is the governor of Judea. Paul's the one in the jail cell. But he asked Paul's permission if he can move him back to Jerusalem. In other words, Festus is telling us without telling us, this is not a common criminal. This guy's not really guilty of anything. He's a Roman citizen. I don't really find any fault. It's the same thing that Pilate did. Pilate said, I don't really find fault in Jesus. I mean, you guys keep telling me all this stuff, but I don't see it. I don't see the evidence. And then he, wishing to appease the Jews, said, I'll let you pick Barabbas or Jesus. At least get you off my back. It's kind of what he's doing. I'm gonna let you decide whether you want to go back or not. What do you think Paul's going to do? Look at verse 10. But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know. So what's Paul's answer? No, I'm not going back. Not doing it. Look at verse 11. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of these things is true, of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. That's his right as a Roman citizen. So the offer is, I don't want the Jews mad, so will you be willing to go back to Jerusalem? Paul turned them down flat, said, I'm not doing that. Because I think Paul's a little bit afraid that popular opinion in Jerusalem, because think about it, I don't know the numbers, it doesn't tell us the numbers, but let's just speculate. Let's say there's 20,000 Jews in Jerusalem. Now, let's say 100 came with Festus. And so let's say there's 100 Jews around, say, hey, he did it, he's guilty, he's all this. And Paul's, no, I didn't do it. And Festus said, well, you go back to Jerusalem. Well, now I think Paul's kind of afraid, if I go back to Jerusalem, 20,000 Jews yelling might sway this governor more than 100. And so I'm not really in the West, 20,000 Jews all hollering that I'm guilty, they want me dead, because they might convince this guy. So, no. And he says, I appeal to Caesar. I want to go to Caesar. It's the right of every Roman citizen, if they think they're in danger of some kind of violent coercion. If they think the deck is stacked against them, or they're going to be executed or unfairly tried, every Roman citizen, no matter where they are in the province, has a right to appeal to Caesar. Now, here's a good trivia for you, because when I tell you who the emperor was, Caesar was, the emperor, you're going to think, why did Paul want to go talk to him? Because at this particular time, the emperor in Rome is Nero. He's the guy that's in charge in Rome. As a matter of fact, he's been in charge for a while. But he's a different guy. From AD 54 to 62, which this falls in that range. This is between AD 54 and 62. Between AD 54 and 62, Nero was considered a really compassionate ruler. He was nice. He was very charitable. He was very understanding. He was very reasonable. And so Paul had no reason to be afraid. In 62, some things happened, and Nero flipped. And he started blaming Christians. He started persecuting them. If this had been in 62, Paul would have said, oh, I'm not going to talk to that guy. He hates us. But this is before Nero got crazy. And so Paul said, I'd rather go talk to Nero. And so that's where he's going to head. Look at verse 12. Then when Festus had conferred with his council, we don't know who that is. I don't know if that's a certain group of advisors, or it's not the Sanhedrin. It's probably just some of his political advisors. But he conferred with his council. He answered, you have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you shall go. What do you think Festus thinks that he got off the hook? That now his hands really are tied. Now he can say to the Jews that are fussing, no, I can do. He appealed to Caesar. It's like a police lieutenant or a police detective interviewing a suspect in the interrogation room. As soon as that guy in the interrogation says, I want a lawyer, it stops. The police officer's hands are tied. They can't continue because anything they say can't be used. So it stops it. When you appeal to Caesar, it's kind of the same principle. And so Festus could then say to the Jews, hey guys, he called for the emperor. There's nothing I can do. We got to send him to Rome. He's got to go there. And so now Festus looks really good in this, because Paul likes him, because Paul didn't send him back to Jerusalem. He treated Paul kindly. The Jews halfway respect him because there's nothing he can do, and they know that there's nothing he can do. Even though they don't agree with the Roman rule, they know the law. They know what has to happen because they live under it. And so he's going to go back. Now, this is here's going to be a little bit of a transition, because Luke's telling this story, and with Festus and Felix, and later on Agrippa, but with Festus and Felix, it's an unusual case. Paul is not a helpless victim. Paul is not just at the mercy of everybody. At the right time, he witnessed to Felix. And Felix said, well, maybe if you come back at a more opportune time, maybe it's a better time for me. And then he's about to do the same thing to Festus. And then he's going to do it to Agrippa. And so the narrator of the story, Luke's telling the story, and he's making sure that he shows us during each one of these confrontations, Paul's opportunistic. As soon as he has an opening to share the gospel, that's exactly what he's going to do. With Felix, he struck out. With Drusilla, he struck out. As far as we know, neither one of them got saved and converted. I mean, Felix we really don't know. Drusilla, we're not sure, but she died 30, 40 years later. So, I mean, we're hoping she did. But they're going to send him to the emperor. So look at verse 13. Because there's another character that comes into the story, and his story is in chapter 26. Verse 13, now when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa, that's Herod Agrippa the first, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. So King Agrippa, his name is Marcus Julius Agrippa the first. Him and his wife Bernice, he is the son of Herod Agrippa the first. This is the second. This is Agrippa the second. His daddy is Agrippa the first. He is the grandson, or actually the great-grandson of Herod the Great. And they show up in Caesarea. As a matter of fact, this guy's great-uncle beheaded John the Baptist. So it's not a family that's been nice to Christians over the years, or God-fearers. And so his great-uncle beheaded John the Baptist, and now Paul has to face that guy's nephew. He's got to stand before Agrippa II. He grew up in Rome. He was one of the emperor's favorites. They really liked him. He was he was the last in his dynasty. It's the Herodian dynasty, all the Herods. He's the last of that dynasty. And here's where the Bible and history ties in. Because one of the guys that wrote a history of the New Testament, whose name is not in the Bible, was one of his best friends. His name's Flavius Josephus. So if you ever read the works of Josephus, where Josephus writes about things going on in the Bible time that's not in the Bible, it's considered very reliable, very first-hand knowledge of things outside the Bible. Him and Herod were buddies. I mean, him and Agrippa II were buddies. And so now he shows up in Caesarea, and he's gonna talk. He's just visiting. He lived in Caesarea Philippi. There's two Caesareas. There's Caesarea Maritima, which is on the coast, and there's Caesarea Philippi, which is, you remember the Old Testament, the tribes of Judah. Remember the tribe of Dan? Dan, when they got their inheritance, Dan went north. Maritima, Caesarea Maritima is northwest. Dan's northeast. So he lives in the northeast corner, up where the gates of hell are at, where Jesus went with the disciples and said, "Who do men say that I am?" And they said, "Some say you're Elijah." And Peter said, "You're the Christ, Son of the living God." And Jesus said, "Upon that rock I'll build my church." That's where this Herod's from. That's where he's from. that very paganistic land. I mean, they worship the god Pan there. He's a very pagan. So now he's there. And so now he's getting to question Paul. Agrippa and his wife Bernice, they came evidently semi-frequently to the coast in order to pay their respects to the governor. And so, because that's where he lives. And so now they're going to come, and Festus is the new governor. And I don't know if they know what's going on with Paul, but they just happen to show up. This is their day to visit. Hey, we got this new governor in Judea. We've not met him yet. Let's go meet him. Let's go pay our respects. And so they head over to Caesarea, and when they get there, all this stuff is going on. So look at verse 14. While they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king. So Festus evidently wanted to discuss Paul's case with a higher-up because he wanted to clarify the charges. He's still not sure why they're accusing Paul. And so Agrippa, because of where he's from and because of growing up in the Herodian family, because the Herodians were Idumeans. If you know what an Idumean is part Edomite, part Israelite. So they have Jewish in their blood. Even though they're not really religious, they have Jewish in their blood. So Agrippa II is considered in this time one of the experts in Jewish law. And so Festus said, hey, you know all about this stuff. Let me lay it out with you. And you tell me what I need to do. I don't know. I can't figure this thing out. And that goes all the way through verse 21. Let me just read them. Verse 15, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him, death. I answered them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. So after they had assembled here, I did not delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought before me. When the accusers stood up, they began bringing charges against him, not of such crimes as I was expecting. It's different than what I thought. But they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion. It's the same conclusion as Felix. They both decided this is a religious matter. Y'all are having a theological debate. There's no crime here. That's what's going on. So verse they had a debate about a dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. So what's that hinge around? The resurrection. It's about the resurrection. Verse 20, being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand trial on these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I send him to Caesar. So he's just reiterating what happened. So what's this basically boiled down to? It's a matter of Paul's belief in the resurrection. The Sadducees don't believe it. Pharisees do believe in a resurrection, but they believe Paul perverted it. So it's a theological thing, and that's what both of these governors decide. So then you get to verse 22. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. So Agrippa said, I want to hear Paul. I want to see what he's got to say. Look what Festus said. Tomorrow you can. In other words, immediately. I mean, he really agreed. He's like, yeah, let me get him off my hands. You deal with him. You talk to him. So that's the plan. Now, all this kind of correlates to Jesus because Jesus went through the same thing. And then Jesus stood before a king too. Remember who the king was? Herod Antipas the first. And so it kind of follows the same line. So now when we get to verse 23, and this is what I hate about these man-made divisions, because chapter 25 verse 23 actually goes all the way through chapter 26 verse 32. So it splits it up. And so starting in verse 23 is Paul's defense before Agrippa. So this is his sixth defense of himself. First was to the Jews, second to the Sanhedrin, third to Felix, fourth to him, fifth to this guy, and then he's going to go on. So listen to his defense. And actually, this is the fifth in the sequence. To Festus was the shortest. This is the longest. This is the longest one of the defenses that he gives right here. And here's what this does. If you're interested in what we call the harmony of the Gospels or the harmony of Scripture, how it ties together, here's what this defense does. Everything that Luke writes about evangelism and ministry in Luke and Acts, it's kind of summed up in Paul's defense. It harmonizes his evangelistic approach. We're not going to finish it tonight because it goes all the way through chapter 26, but we'll start it. Look at verse 23. So on the next day, when Agrippa came together with Bernice in great pomp amid great pomp, and entered the auditorium, accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. So it's a big affair. And the commander, just to give you an idea, it says accompanied by the commanders. We don't know how many, but each one of the commanders would have brought 1,000 soldiers with him. So several thousand Roman soldiers here. So, verse 24, Festus said, King Agrippa, and all you gentlemen here present with us, you see this man, here present with us, you see this man about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, both at Jerusalem and here loudly declaring that he not ought to live any longer. But I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. Yet I have nothing definite about him to write to my Lord. Therefore I brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems absurd to me in sending a prisoner not to indicate also the charges against him. Then we're going to pick up in chapter 26 with what Paul had to say. So you see what Festus is doing. Festus said he appealed to the emperor. I had no choice. I got to send him to the emperor. However, I don't know what to tell the emperor. I don't know what to tell Nero. I don't know what the charges are. So I got him before you guys because you're the expert in the law. I want him to appeal to you so that maybe after all this is over with, I can figure out something that I can write to Nero. Because look at Festus's words. It just doesn't seem right to send a prisoner all the way to Rome and can't even tell the emperor what charges are against him. So we got to figure something out. So in chapter 26, Festus and Paul are going to have a discussion. And Paul is going to get to witness to, Agrippa, and Paul is going to get to witness to King Agrippa. So Paul's just gradually working his way up the chain as far as he can go. Any questions about that? Yeah, it's very good reading. If you take time and I know I go through it pretty quick, but if you ever want to just take time and read through Acts, slowly and jot down some stuff, it's pretty wild stories, the way God brought all this to pass. Anybody? All right. Any additions to our prayer list? Scott?